It's strange how something born out of rebellion can so easily become what it once resisted. Sikhism began as a rejection of the hollow rituals, caste hierarchies, and dogmas of its time. A bold assertion that divinity could not be monopolized by priests or confined within temples. Guru Nanak's words carried the spark of rebellion, that truth belongs not to the scriptures, but to the sincere mind, not to the rituals, but to the realization. Yet, as the centuries turned, that spark, as all sparks do when institutionalized, began to flicker behind layers of reverence, repetition, and routine. What started as a movement against religious structure gradually shaped itself into one. The irony is delicate, almost poetic. Sikhism rose as a cry for liberation from formality, yet today its followers are often bound by forms, from the uncut hair and turban to the 5 Ks that symbolize identity. What was once a personal expression of discipline became a uniform, and the moment something becomes uniform, individuality starts to suffocate. The religion that sought to dissolve the ego through equality unknowingly nurtured a new kind of ego, one of distinctness, of spiritual pride, of we are not like them. There is beauty in distinctness, yes, but also danger. The very insistence on external symbols, no matter how noble in origin, risks turning spirituality into performance. When faith begins to wear a costume, truth quietly leaves the room, because truth never needed an outfit. It was naked, honest, inconvenient, and human beings couldn't bear to look at it for too long. The Sikh gurus spoke of Nam, the remembrance of the divine through constant awareness, a beautiful idea, that the divine isn't trapped in temples but lives in the rhythm of existence itself. Yet, how quickly humans can turn awareness into an obligation. The recitation of prayers, the repeating of hymns, the mechanical reading of the Guru Granth Sahib, all done with discipline, but sometimes without presence. When remembrance becomes routine, it ceases to be remembrance at all. It becomes a spiritual autopilot. The lips move, but the mind wanders elsewhere. There is a certain tragic comedy in that, the human tendency to take the infinite and fold it into a schedule, to say, I will remember the divine at 5 a.m., then forget it for the rest of the day, as though awareness can be compartmentalized, like a gym routine for the soul. The gurus spoke of transcending duality, yet the practice of Sikhism today is deeply dualistic, sacred and secular, pure and impure, Sikh and non-Sikh. What was meant to erase boundaries became another map of them. The contradiction runs deeper when one examines Sikhism's relationship with violence. The religion teaches compassion, humility, and service, Seva, yet it also glorifies the warrior spirit, the Sant Sipahi, saint soldier. This is not hypocrisy. It is human complexity dressed in divine justification. The warrior ideal emerged from historical necessity, a time when defense was survival, but over time, necessity hardened into identity. The sword, once a tool, became a symbol, and symbols, once venerated, begin to speak louder than the truths they were meant to protect. Religion often has a genius for turning history into holiness. Acts born out of circumstance are later canonized as divine commandments. The Khalsa, created to unite and protect, became a sanctified standard of purity. But purity is a dangerous word. It always divides. It whispers that some are closer to truth than others, that some are born into grace while others must seek it through obedience. The gurus spoke of equality, yet even within the faith, hierarchies subtly return, not of caste now, but of devotion, of orthodoxy, of appearance. One kind of purity replaced another, and the circle closed neatly upon itself. What's fascinating is how Sikhism, while preaching that God is beyond form, simultaneously reveres the physical book, the Guru Granth Sahib, as the eternal Guru itself. It's a profound concept, wisdom made sacred, not a person, but a text. Yet here too, human psychology betrays its old reflexes. The book is treated not merely as a vessel of truth, but as a living being, adorned, fanned, bowed before, carried with ritual precision. It's as if humanity cannot bear abstract reverence. We need something to touch, to worship, to dress and feed. In our hands, ideas become idols, and even paper can become a priest. Perhaps the gurus foresaw this, which is why their teachings emphasize inner experience over external show. Yet history shows that no teaching, no matter how enlightened, is safe from the gravitational pull of ritualization. Every path to truth eventually builds a toll gate. Sikhism, in seeking to escape the prisons of other religions, built its own, more humane perhaps, more poetic, but still a prison of belonging and belief. The concept of Ik Onkar, that there is one reality, is among the most profound metaphysical insights ever articulated. It denies polytheism, but also challenges anthropomorphic theism. It suggests unity beyond names, beyond personhood. Yet humans, being linguistic creatures, always drag the infinite into grammar. We turn one into he into God, and God into an entity that watches, rewards, and punishes. The abstract collapses into the personal, and in that collapse, the freedom of the idea is lost. Ik Onkar was supposed to free consciousness from division. Instead, it's become a chant repeated without comprehension. Sacred sound stripped of its silence. When Guru Nanak said, "There is no Hindu, there is no Muslim," he was declaring the end of labels. But labels have a way of resurrecting themselves, dressed in new names. Now there are Sikhs and non-Sikhs, the insiders and the outsiders, those who wear the turban and those who don't, those who follow Rehat Maryada, the code of conduct, and those who are fallen. The ego quietly smiles beneath the beard of humility. Religions often mistake devotion for depth. The louder the chant, the more sacred it seems. But truth doesn't raise its voice. It whispers. It whispers in the quiet space between belief and doubt, the space where the gurus themselves once stood. Yet the followers, too uncomfortable with silence, built temples to echo their certainty. The Gurudwara, meant as a place of equality too, has become layered with unspoken hierarchies. Those who read the scriptures, those who organize the langar, those who donate, those who lead. Even the kitchen of humility can't escape the seasoning of status. Humanity has an extraordinary talent for smuggling ego into acts of virtue. Service becomes pride, charity becomes credit, worship becomes performance. The same psychology repeats itself in every faith, only the vocabulary changes. If Sikhism's early vision was to dissolve the distance between the divine and the human, the modern practice has reintroduced it. Only now, it's hidden behind reverence. The scripture becomes the voice of God, the gurus become intermediaries, and God again becomes someone out there. The illusion of direct experience gives way to mediated devotion. What was once an inward journey is now an external pilgrimage. There's a subtle tragedy in the way institutions fossilize spirit. They take living wisdom and embalm it in rituals, preserving it beautifully, but draining it of breath. The same can be said of Sikhism's relationship with simplicity. The gurus preached a life of honest labor, humility, and detachment. Yet, in the modern diaspora, the faith often thrives in ornate temples, gold-plated shrines, lavish weddings, and elaborate festivals. The external grandeur reflects not spiritual wealth, but spiritual nostalgia, an attempt to feel connected by spectacle, not by understanding. And yet, one must acknowledge that Sikhism's ethical core remains among the most admirable of any religion. The principles of equality, community service, and justice are undeniably noble. But nobility alone does not make something free from contradiction. In fact, the nobler the idea, the easier it is to disguise the ego behind it. When one believes their moral system is divinely ordained, self-righteousness becomes inevitable. Compassion, under divine endorsement, can easily turn into condescension. Religion, even at its best, turns humanity into caretakers of its own delusions. Noble delusions, perhaps, comforting ones, but delusions nonetheless. Sikhism's attempt to balance mysticism with practicality, devotion with duty, individuality with community, is beautiful but fragile. And fragility, when sanctified, becomes taboo to question. The real rebellion would not be in wearing the 5 Ks or reciting the Japji Sahib. It would be in daring to think as Uwa, freely as Guru Nanak did when he stood before orthodoxy and said, "None of you have the monopoly on truth." That statement in its essence was an invitation to think without fear. Yet today, questioning within religion is treated as arrogance, when in truth, it is reverence of the highest kind, reverence for the truth itself. One of the most fascinating paradoxes within Sikh belief is the tension between individuality and obedience, between being a free-thinking seeker and being part of a disciplined collective. Sikhism honors both, the independence of the soul and the harmony of the group. But these two ideals rarely coexist peacefully. A group that prizes conformity cannot nurture free minds for long, and a mind that questions too freely soon finds itself standing outside the circle of belonging. Every religion builds its walls in the name of unity. Sikhism calls its wall Rehat Maryada, the code of conduct, a set of principles designed to protect the purity of the faith. Noble, yes, necessary perhaps, but also dangerous. Because once a way of living is standardized, conscience becomes negotiable. People stop asking, "Why is this sacred?" and begin asking, "What happens if I don't do it?" The fear of exclusion replaces the pursuit of understanding. Spirituality becomes compliance in disguise. There's a quiet irony here. Sikhism emerged to liberate people from religious prescriptions, from the Hindu obsession with ritual purity and the Muslim rigidity of law. Yet centuries later, it built its own manual of divine behavior, the same architecture painted in new colors. Humans don't abandon their cages, they redecorate them. You can see this psychology play out in small, everyday gestures. A Sikh child grows up being told not to cut their hair, not because it's a personal choice rooted in reflection, but because it's what makes you a true Sikh. The question of meaning is replaced by the authority of tradition. The turban becomes a badge of virtue rather than an expression of awareness. The act of wearing it ceases to be symbolic of discipline and becomes an unspoken test of loyalty. Identity, once tied to inner conviction, turns into a social passport, and once identity is sanctified, it becomes untouchable. To question its purpose is to threaten the very foundation of communal belonging. That's why so few dare to ask simple questions like, if God is formless, why must I express devotion through form? Or, if all are equal before the divine, why should external appearance define spiritual worth? This psychological shift, from internal understanding to external obedience, is not unique to Sikhism. It's the same transformation that corrodes every great idea once it solidifies into an institution. The moment spirituality needs protection, it has already begun to die. The Sikh concept of hukam, divine order, illustrates another delicate contradiction. The idea is that everything happens by God's command. Nothing is outside His will. It's a poetic surrender, a recognition of one's smallness in the grand design. But carried too far, it morphs into passivity. When every outcome is divine will, human responsibility blurs. A man may justify injustice, suffering, or failure by whispering, "It was hukam." Fatalism becomes sanctified laziness, and yet the same religion glorifies action, seva, courage, justice. The Sikh is told to fight oppression, but also to accept destiny. The soul is asked to surrender and to struggle simultaneously. One hand is told to hold the sword, the other to bow. It's a beautiful paradox in poetry, but a confusing one in practice. Because how can one fully surrender and still claim moral agency? Either the universe is scripted or it's participatory. It can't be both without bending reason. This inner contradiction reveals a larger truth about the human mind. We crave meaning, but fear chaos. So we invent systems that tell us when to fight and when to submit, when to speak and when to stay silent, all under the illusion that we're following divine order. Religion becomes a way of outsourcing moral uncertainty to a celestial authority. The concept of guru itself reflects this dependency. The Sikh scriptures teach that God resides within, yet the faithful bow to the Guru, Granth Sahib, as the eternal guide. It's as though the human mind can't bear to trust its own inner voice without external validation. We seek certainty outside precisely because we doubt our capacity for truth. The Guru was meant to awaken the teacher within, but over time, it became the substitute for it. This is the psychological sleight of hand that sustains all organized belief. Devotion cloaked as humility is often fear wearing a halo. Fear of being wrong, fear of standing alone, fear of stepping beyond the safety of inherited meaning. It's easier to obey than to confront the silence of freedom. Even the principle of equality, one of Sikhism's most radical gifts to humanity, is often betrayed by its own followers. The langar, the community kitchen, is perhaps the most beautiful social experiment in religious history. Everyone, regardless of caste, status, or gender, sits together and eats. It's a moment of pure humanism. But beyond the Langar Hall in the real world, caste prejudice persists quietly among Sikhs, especially in Punjab and among diaspora communities. Old hierarchies survive beneath new language. People marry within subcastes, associate within social tiers, and call it culture instead of discrimination. It's the same old story. When religion declares equality, ego finds a loophole. It turns equality into ritual, equality performed, not lived. Eating together for an hour cannot undo centuries of inherited arrogance. The mind nods to equality in the temple but bows to hierarchy at home. And still, Sikhism insists that God lives in all, that divinity pervades existence. If this is truly believed, then why the obsession with purity, appearance, or religious correctness? The human mind, it seems, loves to divide even when its doctrine forbids it. It carves duality out of unity, then worships its own contradictions. This duality extends even to Sikhism's view of suffering. The faith teaches that pain and joy are both part of God's will, gifts from the same hand. Accept them with grace. It's a noble idea, stoicism dressed in spiritual poetry. But it can also dull compassion. When suffering is romanticized as divine testing, injustice becomes tolerable. It's God's plan becomes the easiest way to look away. In this way, religion gently replaces empathy with endurance. It teaches acceptance, which can be wisdom, or anesthesia. It can free you from resentment or lull you into complacency. The difference lies in consciousness, and consciousness is precisely what routine devotion tends to numb. There's a profound psychological pattern at play here, the same one that operates in all faiths that begin as revolutions. A religion starts by liberating people from authority. It calls them to look inward, to find divinity without intermediaries. Then, as it grows, it becomes the very authority it once defied. The rebellion becomes law. The seeker becomes the subject. The truth becomes the brand. Sikhism's beauty lies in its defiance of dogma, yet its tragedy lies in its preservation of it, under softer names. The hymns that once dismantled religious hierarchy are now recited with ritual hierarchy. The gurus who once questioned everything are now shielded from questioning. A movement that began as a cry for spiritual freedom slowly built an empire of reverence. And perhaps this is inevitable. Humans cannot bear for truth to remain fluid. We crave permanence, even if it means fossilizing wisdom into stone. The moment something is declared sacred, it stops evolving. Sikhism, like all religions, wanted to be a river, but its followers built temples on the banks and called the stillness holy. The divine, if it exists, must laugh quietly at this, watching mortals argue over the right way to describe the infinite. There's something almost poetic about how humans speak of liberation, while constructing elaborate systems to achieve it. In Sikhism, the idea of mukti, liberation from the cycle of birth and death, mirrors this paradox perfectly. Liberation is the ultimate goal, yet it's sought through devotion, remembrance, and adherence to divine order. In other words, freedom must be earned through obedience. It's a curious equation. Follow the rules until you're free of them. The gurus describe mukti as union with the divine, dissolving the ego into the infinite. Yet the very structure of religion sustains ego by giving it identity. I am devout. I am chosen. I am Khalsa. Even the concept of selflessness becomes another self to protect. The ego doesn't die, it reincarnates in spiritual language. And this is perhaps the most subtle illusion of all, the spiritual ego. It bows lower than others, speaks softer, appears humble, yet it secretly believes itself closer to truth. It is the same ego that builds temples to humility and sings hymns about equality. The greatest deception is the one that dresses itself as virtue. Religion, when institutionalized, has an instinct for self-preservation. It transforms even rebellion into tradition. Sikhism's early defiance of caste, ritual, and dogma was revolutionary. Yet, over time, those rejections hardened into identity markers. We reject that. Therefore, we are us. The rejection became another wall. To say, we are not Hindus, we are not Muslims, was once a radical proclamation of freedom from categories. Today, it functions as another category. This is the fate of all truths. The moment they are repeated without re-experiencing, they turn into slogans. And slogans, however noble, belong to crowds, not to consciousness. Even the Sikh ideal of Nam Simran, remembrance of God's name, carries within it this tension between presence and performance. The practice was intended as a way of dissolving the mind into awareness, a quiet merging with the eternal. But repetition, when done out of duty, numbs rather than awakens. Chanting becomes a kind of spiritual noise cancellation, drowning out doubt, guilt, and thought. It soothes, but it doesn't awaken. This is where religion often mistakes stillness for awareness. Stillness is the absence of motion. Awareness is the presence of perception. You can sit silently for hours without ever being awake. You can recite for years without once remembering what remembrance means. The mechanical rhythm of prayer offers comfort, but comfort is not consciousness. When Guru Nanak spoke of oneness, Ik Onkar, he was pointing beyond words, beyond symbols, beyond theology. It was a metaphysical statement about the unity of existence, not a slogan of sectarian identity. But human beings cannot live long without distinctions. They need flags, forms, boundaries, something to define where we end and they begin. So, the Infinite One was reduced to a brand of the infinite. The word that was meant to erase categories became the label of one. The divine, which is everywhere, was confined to the vocabulary of the faithful. It's an old human tragedy, the urge to make the ungraspable feel graspable. Sikhism's theology also dances uneasily with morality. It preaches equality and justice, but insists that all acts, good or evil, occur under divine will. If God is the doer of all things, then human virtue becomes cosmic theater. The murderer and the saint both move by the same will, yet only one is punished and the other praised. It's moral paradox disguised as devotion. The mind, uneasy with contradiction, invents explanations. That divine will is perfect, but human perception is limited. A neat way of resolving absurdity, by declaring that logic itself is too small to contain truth. But that is not a solution. It is surrender disguised as understanding. It allows religion to preserve contradiction without discomfort. Perhaps the gurus didn't mean to create a theology at all. Perhaps they only meant to express an experience, a moment of direct perception, a seeing without filter. But the followers, needing order, turn poetry into policy. Mystics speak in metaphor. The faithful build monuments from metaphors. The Guru Granth Sahib itself is filled with paradoxes meant to dissolve the intellect. Yet human beings, being naturally insecure before mystery, try to interpret, categorize, and defend those paradoxes as doctrines. The result is a text meant to liberate thought, becoming a manual for controlling it. Even the communal aspects of Sikhism, Sangat, community, and Pangat, eating together, are double-edged. On one hand, they break down social divisions. On the other, they create dependency on collective validation. The individual's spiritual worth is constantly measured against communal conformity. A person who meditates in solitude is seen as distant from the group, almost suspiciously independent. But solitude is where truth speaks loudest. The crowd's noise, even when holy, drowns it out. There's something deeply human in that need for togetherness, the comfort of shared belief, the rhythm of collective prayer, the feeling of belonging. But belonging, when sanctified, easily becomes surveillance. Every religion evolves its own subtle police, not with guns, but with glances, whispers, expectations. You don't need to be excommunicated when disapproval does the job just as well. What keeps the system intact is the illusion that questioning it equals betrayal. But if truth is truly divine, how could it ever be threatened by a question? The fact that religion must defend itself from inquiry proves it's built on insecurity, not revelation. And so, the very soul of Sikhism, its philosophical brilliance, its poetic transcendence, gets buried beneath cultural loyalty. To question a practice is seen as questioning the guru. To question the guru is seen as arrogance. But wasn't Guru Nanak's entire life one long act of questioning? Perhaps the greatest loyalty to a teacher is to emulate their courage, not their conformity. Yet, over generations, loyalty mutates into imitation. The mind stops exploring and starts preserving. The teachings become heirlooms, not living truths. This is why religion can never remain pure. Not Sikhism, not any of them. Purity requires stillness, but life is motion. The moment a belief moves through time, it gathers dust of history, politics, pride, fear. Sikhism, too, has not escaped that corrosion. In modern contexts, it often manifests as cultural pride more than philosophical depth. The emphasis on external symbols, the turban, the beard, the steel bracelet, has become a badge of identity, sometimes even resistance. It's a statement. We remember who we are, but beneath that pride lurks an anxiety, the fear of dissolution, of losing distinctness in a world too vast to comprehend. And that fear, though understandable, quietly betrays the central teaching of oneness. For if all is one, what is there to lose? The Sikh diaspora offers a fascinating study in how religion evolves once it leaves its homeland. Thousands of miles from Punjab, the religion's symbols, the turban, the beard, the 5 Ks, become markers not just of devotion, but of identity, of resistance, of social cohesion. The symbols that once represented discipline and inner awareness now carry the weight of cultural survival. Devotion is inseparable from belonging. Spirituality is inseparable from ethnicity. The divine becomes intertwined with the social. This is not unique to Sikhism, of course. Every transplanted faith adapts. Yet there's a subtle irony here. In seeking to protect authenticity, the diaspora often emphasizes the very forms that Guru Nanak sought to de-emphasize. The external becomes a proxy for the internal. The badge of faith is easier to wear than the burden of introspection. And yet, the inner contradictions persist. The youth may be proud of the turban, yet alienated from the meaning it once symbolized. They may chant the hymns flawlessly while struggling to grasp the philosophical depth beneath the verses. They inherit devotion without necessarily inheriting understanding. It's a familiar pattern in all inherited belief systems. Ritual outpaces reflection, tradition outpaces insight. Take the idea of equality, for instance. It is perhaps Sikhism's most radical principle: no caste, no hierarchy, no discrimination. Yet the diaspora often carries subtler hierarchies: social, economic, and even ritualistic. The communal kitchens still operate beautifully, but behind the scenes, people sort themselves, consciously or unconsciously, by status, subcaste, and observance. The ideal of equality, so central to the faith's philosophy, becomes aspirational rather than operative. There's a quiet, almost tragic humor in this. Humans invent symbols and rituals to transcend the ego, yet the ego survives. It survives in turban pride, in meticulous adherence to ritual, in the subtle policing of language, appearance, and practice. Even the practice of seva, selfless service, can become a stage for moral superiority. The volunteer who washes the dishes in the Gurudwara may feel morally elevated, not humbler. The mind has a talent for turning virtue into self-regard. Modern Sikh identity also wrestles with the tension between visibility and authenticity. The turban is a statement. I exist, I am present, I am not invisible. Yet the assertion of visibility is often necessary precisely because the substance beneath it, contemplation, inner growth, awareness, cannot be observed. Belief becomes a performance. Faith becomes theater. The outward signals are so carefully curated that they risk replacing the inner reality they were meant to reflect. Even political engagement intersects awkwardly with spirituality. In Punjab, in diaspora communities, Sikhism often overlaps with nationalist sentiment. The religion that once transcended divisions now becomes intertwined with territorial and ethnic pride. The spiritual message is gradually interpreted through the lens of collective identity. Justice, courage, and equality, once metaphysical ideals, are reframed as social and political imperatives. The divine merges with human ambition. And yet, in that fusion lies another paradox. The religion that teaches surrender to God now also demands vigilance in the world. The saint-soldier ideal persists, but the soldier is rarely metaphorical. It is literal, a call to defend not just morality, but community, to safeguard identity. The inward journey toward detachment coexists uneasily with outward battles for status, respect, and survival. All this reflects a profound human truth: the tension between freedom and belonging. Every faith must navigate it. The individual seeks liberation. The community seeks cohesion. The mind that wants to see the infinite finds itself constrained by collective expectation. The faith that wants to dissolve ego finds ego everywhere, in ritual, in pride, in the very act of belonging. Perhaps this is why Sikhism, like all organized religions, feels simultaneously liberating and constraining. It offers profound moral and metaphysical insights, the oneness of reality, the importance of service, the call to courage, yet packages them within social and ritual structures that inevitably dilute them. The deeper the principle, the more vulnerable it is to human reinterpretation. The higher the ideal, the more it risks becoming a ladder for the ego. Consider the metaphor of light. The Guru Granth Sahib often compares truth to a lamp. A lamp can illuminate, but only if it burns without obstruction. Once we cover it with rituals, symbols, hierarchies, or dogmas, its light diminishes. We carry the lamp as a badge, as a talisman, yet fail to allow it to illuminate our own understanding. The symbolism overshadows the essence, and still the beauty remains. Despite contradictions, despite human frailty, Sikhism persists as a faith of remarkable ethical and spiritual clarity. Its insistence on compassion, justice, and remembrance transcends ritualistic obsession. Its early rejection of caste and hierarchy remains revolutionary even centuries later. Its poetry continues to challenge the mind, to inspire reflection. The contradictions, the human missteps, the cultural overlays, they do not erase the underlying philosophy, but they remind us that truth is never immune to human interpretation. Sikhism teaches that divinity is within, yet the faithful often seek it outside, in symbols, in community, in observance. The challenge is not unique to Sikhism. It is the universal challenge of every path that claims to touch the infinite. How to integrate human nature with the transcendent. How to honor ritual without sacrificing awareness. How to serve without inflating the self. How to belong without losing sight of freedom. In this light, Sikhism becomes a mirror. Not a perfect mirror, but one that reflects both aspiration and limitation. It shows how humans reach for transcendence and stumble over the ego. How the noblest intentions can be subtly undermined by the need for validation. It demonstrates, gently but firmly, that the sacred is not immune to the absurdities of human psychology. And here lies the quiet lesson for any observer. The most profound faiths can be simultaneously inspiring and contradictory, beautiful and flawed. The divine ideal exists, perhaps, but the human implementation always carries its signature: pride, fear, habit, and longing. Sikhism, in all its complexity, does not escape this rule. It is, in essence, a human religion trying to teach humans something beyond themselves. That tension, that paradox, is the pulse of its enduring fascination. Walk into any Gurudwara on a weekend, and you'll see the living theater of Sikh identity unfold. The floors are immaculate, the scripture gleams under careful hands, the langar runs with clockwork precision. On the surface, it's perfection, a testament to discipline, community, and devotion. Yet beneath that order lies the subtle negotiation between ritual and consciousness. Devotion is measured by participation, by the exactitude of practice, not necessarily by the depth of understanding. The soul, it seems, is optional. Observe the langar, the communal meal designed to dissolve social hierarchies. On paper, it is the crowning experiment in equality. Rich and poor, male and female, elder and child, sitting together, eating the same food. Yet, even here, human nature quietly asserts itself. Elders sit slightly apart, children cluster, volunteers compete for recognition in the kitchen. The principle is noble, the practice is human. The ideal of pure equality is beautiful, but it has to negotiate with comfort, habit, and subtle pride. Even the 5 Ks, the physical markers of faith, carry layered contradictions. Kesh, the uncut hair, symbolizes discipline and obedience. Kangha, the comb, represents cleanliness and order. Kara, the steel bracelet, signifies restraint. Kachra, the undergarment, hints at self-control. Kirpan, the ceremonial sword, embodies courage. Each is a profound moral or spiritual concept. Yet collectively, they form a uniform, an identity badge, a social signal that says, "I am a true Sikh." The intended inward meaning is often overshadowed by the outward display. Symbols meant to nurture discipline and mindfulness become markers of status and belonging. The diaspora experience intensifies this tension. In countries where Sikhs are a minority, adherence to these symbols can become an act of defiance, a way to assert identity in a world that may not understand. Wearing a turban, carrying a kirpan, letting hair grow long, these acts are simultaneously spiritual, cultural, and political. Yet they risk overshadowing the deeper spiritual principles that motivated the original practices. External observance can flourish while inner reflection stagnates. Consider the daily ritual of prayer and meditation. Sikhism emphasizes Simran, the remembrance of God. Yet repetition alone cannot guarantee awareness. Chanting verses mechanically, reciting hymns without reflection, can lull the mind into the illusion of devotion. A believer may complete the prayers, check the boxes, and feel morally and spiritually secure, while the deeper questions about ego, desire, mortality, and meaning remain unexplored. Devotion becomes performance, and performance masquerades as enlightenment. The tension between communal conformity and individual reflection is constant. A Sikh is encouraged to integrate into society, to work, to serve, to participate in the collective life of the faith. Yet spiritual depth requires solitude, questioning, and introspection. The balance is delicate. Too much integration and consciousness is diluted. Too much solitude and social belonging suffers. Humans are caught perpetually between these poles, and the resulting compromises often go unexamined. Even courage, a central value in Sikhism, is not immune to subtle paradox. The ideal of the Sansipahi, the saint soldier, is to uphold justice, protect the vulnerable, and confront oppression without attachment. Noble, inspiring, yet it carries the risk of valorization. When bravery becomes a performance, it feeds pride rather than moral clarity. Fighting for justice can easily become fighting for identity, reputation, or belonging. The line between moral duty and social assertion is thin, and humans often blur it without noticing. Sikh history itself illustrates this interplay of ideals and human tendencies. The early gurus challenged orthodoxy, defied ritualism, and emphasized the inner life. Yet as communities grew, codification followed. The creation of the Khalsa standardized practice, codified identity, and provided security, but also introduced new pressures, new expectations, new hierarchies. Revolution became institution, liberation became membership. The paradox is inherent. Structures that protect a religion also constrain it. Modern Sikh communities reflect this ongoing negotiation. Political engagement, philanthropy, and social activism are often intertwined with religious identity. Acts of service, the core of seva, can become statements of social authority rather than expressions of humility. The moral compass of the individual is subtly redirected by collective expectation. The line between devotion and social performance blurs, reminding us that the human mind excels at blending principle with pride. Even gender dynamics illustrate subtle contradictions. Sikhism abolished many caste-based restrictions, advocated equality, and celebrated women in scripture. Yet, in practice, patriarchal patterns often persist. Ritual authority, leadership roles, and social influence frequently skew toward men. The principle of equality coexists uneasily with human habit and tradition. Ideals are clear, implementation is messy. Reality is never as clean as philosophy. At the root, these tensions reveal a universal human condition. Faith, any faith, is an encounter between aspiration and limitation. Sikhism's brilliance is in its articulation of the highest aspirations: equality, service, courage, remembrance of the divine, transcendence of ego. Yet human nature, prone to habit, pride, and fear, inevitably reshapes these aspirations to fit comfort, conformity, and identity. Devotion is filtered through psychology. Spiritual practice becomes social ritual. Ideals become symbols. Even the most disciplined practitioner is vulnerable to these currents. A perfectly observant Sikh may bow, meditate, and serve with devotion, yet carry subtle judgments, hidden pride, or unexamined fear. It is not a failure of faith. It is the inseparable shadow of being human. And here lies the quiet lesson. The contradictions within Sikh belief are not accidents. They are reflections of the mind's engagement with the infinite. Sikhism, at its core, is a profound invitation to live fully, think deeply, and act ethically. Yet the invitation is filtered through centuries of human interpretation. Symbols, rituals, and social structures are both guidance and barrier. They teach, inspire, and discipline, yet they can also obscure, constrain, and seduce. The tension between principle and practice, between inner truth and external form, is the pulse of the tradition, and the mirror it holds up to human nature. The deeper one looks into Sikhism, the more apparent the interplay between human limitation and spiritual aspiration becomes. The religion is framed around liberation, freedom from ego, freedom from attachment, freedom from division. Yet the human mind rarely tolerates such openness. It instinctively clasps at certainty, at identity, at belonging. The moment a philosophy speaks of boundlessness, the mind responds by creating boundaries. Ritual, symbol, community, and code emerge naturally, not as deviations, but as expressions of psychological necessity. Consider meditation on Ik Onkar, the one eternal reality. It calls for dissolution of duality, yet devotees approach it through language, posture, and form. The infinite is filtered through finite minds, and inevitably, abstraction is dressed in human habit. Words meant to dissolve the ego can become instruments of ego affirmation. Recitation becomes proof of piety. Observance becomes a ladder for status. The paradox is not external to Sikhism, it is embedded in human consciousness itself. This pattern repeats across every spiritual principle: courage, service, remembrance, equality. All are noble, all are demanding, all are subtly compromised when mediated through human psychology. The ideals do not fail. Humans fail to inhabit them fully. Sikhism's beauty lies in recognizing the gap between principle and practice, even if practice rarely achieves principle. Even the concept of seva, selfless service, illustrates this elegantly. The gurus prescribe service as a way to dissolve ego and cultivate connection to the divine. In practice, humans perform service and feel moral elevation. The act that was meant to annihilate the self strengthens the sense of self. Service becomes social capital. Devotion becomes identity reinforcement. Humility becomes pride in disguise. The paradox is inherent. The very mind seeking freedom interprets freedom in its own image. Diaspora communities amplify this phenomenon. When religion becomes intertwined with cultural identity, devotion carries multiple layers of meaning: spiritual, social, political, and existential. The turban, the kirpan, the uncut hair, they are simultaneously symbols of discipline, markers of belonging, and shields against invisibility. Observing them is no longer purely spiritual, it is existential. The act of keeping the faith becomes a claim of presence in a world that may not notice otherwise. The outer observance substitutes for inner exploration, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Even historical narratives are not immune. Stories of the guru's courage, wisdom, and insight are retold to inspire the faithful, yet in doing so, they create a standard against which human fallibility is measured. The gurus appear flawless, humans appear imperfect. Faithful identification with ideals becomes both aspirational and punitive. Every act of devotion, consciously or unconsciously, is measured against an impossible exemplar. The living experience of the divine becomes filtered through the perfection of memory and text. And yet, this is not a weakness of Sikhism alone. It is the universal dilemma of all religions, the translation of the infinite into the finite. Every act of worship, every ritual, every text becomes a mediation, a bridge between mortal minds and the ungraspable. The bridge is necessary, but it is never the destination. The practice is a tool, not the truth itself. Here lies the subtle tragedy. The tool, once venerated, often becomes the object. Rituals replace reflection. Symbols replace insight. Community replaces contemplation. This human tendency is magnified by the paradoxical nature of divinity in Sikhism. God is immanent and transcendent, formless yet personal, immanent yet unknowable. Humans are invited to experience this unity while navigating a world structured by dualities: rich and poor, pure and impure, insider and outsider. The tension between experience and expression, between principle and practice, creates Both beauty and contradiction. Sikhism's historical commitment to justice and courage intensifies this tension. The saint-soldier ideal enjoins disciples to act in the world, to protect the weak, to confront oppression. Yet action presupposes choice. Surrender presupposes obedience. The faithful are asked to navigate a terrain where freedom and duty, consciousness and conformity, coexist uneasily. A soldier acts on principle, yet his principle is framed within religiously sanctioned duty. Courage is celebrated, yet it risks feeding ego. Freedom is promised, yet submission is required. The interplay is subtle, almost invisible, yet it shapes every moment of practice. Even the simplest practices carry layers of meaning. Meditation, recitation, charity, communal meals, rituals of birth and death. Each is designed to cultivate awareness and connection. Yet each can also become habit, performance, and identity reinforcement. Humans take the sacred and turn it into structure, the infinite and turn it into symbol. The sacred is never immune to psychology. The ideal is never immune to human need. What emerges is a pattern repeated throughout history. The tension between aspiration and implementation, between principle and practice, between the infinite and the finite. Sikhism embodies this pattern with elegance, clarity, and poetry. Its contradictions are not accidental. They are reflective mirrors of human consciousness confronting divinity. The faith teaches liberation, yet humans negotiate it. It teaches equality, yet humans filter it through habit and hierarchy. It teaches courage, yet humans often act from pride. And perhaps this is the point. Sikhism does not deny human limitation. Its teachings anticipate it, structure around it, and invite contemplation precisely because of it. The contradictions, paradoxes, and tensions are not failures of the faith, but demonstrations of its engagement with life as it is lived. The religion's brilliance lies in this dynamic interplay, in creating a space where aspiration meets limitation, where principle meets practice, where humanity meets the infinite. The human soul, in its struggle to follow, understand, and belong, experiences the same contradictions that the gurus themselves observed in existence. Devotion, identity, courage, service, all are mirrors, reflecting both the divine ideal and the human mind that seeks it. Sikhism offers insight into the infinite while exposing the inescapable realities of the finite. It teaches, it challenges, it inspires, but it also humbles. The most remarkable aspect of Sikhism, perhaps, is its insistence that truth is not static, that consciousness matters more than ritual, and that the divine resides in action as much as in belief, yet humans interpret, institutionalize, and perform. The faith's contradictions are the fingerprints of our own nature, traced across centuries of practice and devotion. And here, in this reflection, lies the subtle irony. The religion that began as rebellion against ritual and hierarchy has survived not in spite of human limitations, but because of them. Its teachings, its poetry, its philosophy endure precisely because humans continue to wrestle with their own contradictions, their own need for order, their own desire for meaning. Sikhism, in essence, mirrors the mind, aspirational, flawed, disciplined, creative, and endlessly searching. If Sikhism teaches us anything, it is that the human mind cannot encounter the infinite without simultaneously creating patterns, symbols, and rules. It is impossible not to. We crave structure, comfort, and validation. Yet, Sikhism's genius lies in the constant reminder that these structures are not the truth itself. They are scaffolding, not foundation. We use them to ascend, but all too often, we mistake them for the summit. Consider the Guru's approach to wealth, power, and social influence. Guru Nanak rejected ritualistic piety in favor of honest labor. He rejected caste discrimination in favor of equality. Yet, as the movement expanded, wealth and hierarchy inevitably emerged. Gurudwaras became centers of social organization, and the collection of donations created unintended influence. The principles were pure, but human management introduced human bias. Even in acts of generosity, humans cannot escape the subtle interplay of pride, reputation, and expectation. This tension persists in the contemporary world. Sikhs living across continents navigate multiple identities: spiritual, cultural, social, and national. Their faith provides guidance, ethical structure, and communal belonging. Yet it also imposes subtle pressures to perform devotion visibly, to preserve tradition meticulously, to embody ideals perfectly. The divine principle calls for inner liberation, but human society calls for outer conformity. The two rarely align perfectly, and this is the source of most contradictions. The psychological complexity of Sikh devotion reveals another layer. Faith is meant to dissolve the ego, yet human attachment turns devotion into identity. The mind interprets ethical rigor as moral superiority, ritual observance as proof of authenticity, and community belonging as evidence of virtue. Even humility becomes a point of pride. The religion's brilliance is that it provides constant opportunities for reflection. Yet the human mind often replaces reflection with performance. Even courage, a central tenet, manifests in dual forms. The Sant soldier ideal is to confront injustice selflessly. In practice, however, courage can be conflated with social assertion or symbolic resistance. The external act is celebrated, but internal freedom may lag. Devotion is expressed outwardly, while inner understanding remains subtle, elusive, and often unexamined. The paradox of freedom and duty underpins much of Sikh thought. Surrender to God and adherence to moral principles coexist uneasily with personal choice and responsibility. Humans must navigate the tension between obedience to divine order and action in the world. The tension is subtle, invisible to the untrained eye, yet it shapes every decision: whom to help, how to act ethically, when to speak, when to remain silent. Sikhism also demonstrates the inescapable intersection between faith and human need. Ritual, symbol, and community serve as tools to stabilize consciousness. They offer identity, guidance, and comfort. Yet these very tools can obscure the original principles. The external scaffolding grows dense enough to block sight of the view. Humanity, it seems, requires guidance, but guidance risks becoming containment. The continuity of Sikh practice across centuries illustrates this perfectly. The religion's endurance is not evidence of flawless implementation, but of resilience. The core ideas, equality, remembrance, courage, and service, survive the imperfections of human nature. The contradictions, paradoxes, and limitations do not signify failure, they signify engagement. Sikhism thrives precisely because humans wrestle with its principles, not because they obey them flawlessly. And so, we arrive at a profound observation. The contradictions within Sikh belief are mirrors of our own consciousness. The interplay between principle and practice, ideal and habit, inner awareness and outer observance, reveals not just the structure of the religion, but the structure of human experience itself. Sikhism invites us to confront these tensions thoughtfully, to inhabit the space where aspiration meets limitation, and to recognize that the path to understanding is rarely straight. The interplay of culture, psychology, and philosophy within Sikhism illustrates the subtle mechanisms by which faith is both lived and transformed. Human beings are creative, adaptive, and imaginative, capable of turning spiritual ideals into social realities. Sometimes the translation succeeds in enriching consciousness, sometimes it diminishes it. The tension is perpetual, unavoidable, and deeply instructive. What makes Sikhism particularly remarkable is its insistence that inner awareness, not external observance, is central. The Guru's poetry and teaching constantly point toward direct perception, ethical reflection, and conscious action. Rituals, symbols, and community are not ends in themselves. They are invitations, scaffolding for the mind seeking the infinite. Human beings, however, rarely follow the scaffolding perfectly. We lean on it, we decorate it, we mistake it for freedom. This pattern, the gap between principle and practice, is a universal human experience. Sikhism captures it with rare elegance, turning every act of devotion, every symbol, every ritual, into a lesson in awareness. It challenges us to see beyond appearances, to distinguish between what is done for self and what is done for truth, to question where devotion ends and ego begins. Ultimately, the contradictions of Sikhism are not flaws but features. They are evidence of engagement with life, proof of the mind's endless negotiation between aspiration and limitation. The religion is at once liberating and binding, idealistic and human, spiritual and cultural. Its brilliance is that it allows, even demands, contemplation of these paradoxes. In that space, where awareness meets tradition, where aspiration meets habit, where the infinite touches the finite, the faith comes alive, not as doctrine, but as a living mirror of consciousness itself. Sikhism endures because it reflects us back to ourselves, our longing, our fear, our creativity, our pride, and our aspiration. It is a religion of paradox, a philosophy of tension, and a human experiment in navigating the impossible. The contradictions are not accidental, they are instructive. They are the pulse of the faith and the pulse of humanity.